Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this, which will be our last webinar of the spring quarter. We're very excited about today's presentation. But first, let me start by doing a UCLA land acknowledgement. The Center for Mexican Studies at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Gabrielino and Tonga people. So we're in for a great treat today. We're going to have a book conversation, and I want to remind our audience that this is a webinar style. So if you have any questions, and we encourage participation from the audience, please type in your questions in the Q&A activity icon that you can open at the bottom of your screen. So that's how we're going to take questions. And today we have with us Jazmine Ulloa, who's the author of El Paso, 5 Families and 100 Years of Blood, Migration, Race, and Memory. And it was just published. It's fresh out of the press. We're very excited to hear from Jazmine about this book. And in order to have a conversation, I have my good friend and colleague, Antonieta Mercado, who's a professor of communication at the University of San Diego. So please, Antonieta, take it away, and the floor is yours. And welcome, both of you.
Thank you very much, Gaspar. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Jazmine. This is a wonderful, wonderful book. I just poured into it. It was amazing. Let's welcome Jazmine Ulloa, who is a national politics reporter at the New York Times who covers immigration. She's based in New York, and she travels across the country interviewing families, policymakers, law enforcement, community leaders. She is also a fronteriza who was born in El Paso and grew up on both sides of the border in Ciudad Juarez and El Paso. And she brings a deeply personal understanding to stories about migration, identity, and belonging, with a special focus on the symbolic and political power of the southern border. Before joining the Times, Jazmine was a correspondent to the Boston Globe, to the Los Angeles Times. She covered Congress in the 2020 presidential election. She's a graduate from the University of Texas at Austin, and is the author of this wonderful narrative history of her hometown, El Paso, 5 Families and 100 Years of Blood, Migration, Race, and Memory, the book that I have here holding my hands. Very substantial book. Congratulations for publishing this wonderful book about the border. As you know, I am in San Diego. As I was reading through your book, I was imagining all those stories about crossing the border to Tijuana, coming back to San Diego, and living this binational life that you talk about in your book. This year, after several years of careful work, she's presented this book to us. And I wanted to begin this conversation asking you. You said that somewhere in the middle of the book, you talk about your own initiation as a journalist when you were 16 years old, and you began reporting in El Paso, reporting for your high school newspaper. You even mentioned your dear teacher, dear journalism teacher, Pat Monroe, at the end in the acknowledgements. And you crossed the border with your abuelita, with your grandma, to interview the mothers of a case that was very painful in Mexico's memory, the desaparecidas in Juarez, the women who were found later, their bodies were found in cotton fields. It was very, very painful. And you go across the border, tell your grandma, please drive me because I cannot drive, and interview the families and the lawyer who took some of these cases. My question to you is, how did those early experiences shaped you as a journalist, and also shape this book, right? That experience of you as a teenager crossing the border to cover these stories.
Yeah, so I actually I I thought I was going to be a lawyer. As growing up in a family, an immigrant family, fronterizo. But I'm more of like a fronterizo family, right? Because we crossed a lot, moving back and forth, like I say in the book. But my dad did migrate from Puerto Vallarta, Jalisco, into El Paso. So it's like I have the immigrant fronterizo background. But in these immigrant families, there's usually like these two career paths, right? They have to provide upward mobility. So in my family it was like you have to be a doctor or a lawyer, and I couldn't stand the sight of blood. So I thought in my head I was always going to be a lawyer. But then I joined this journalism program in my at my high school, and my teacher Pat Monroe was just very tenacious. Like she treated us like real journalists. Like if something was breaking in the city or on nationally, she's like, how does this affect El Paso? How does this affect Burgess High School? Like, go out and find the angle, right? And so at the time, I was young, and I was reading a lot about these cases, about these femicides, the Juarez femicides, and it was, this was in the aughts, in the early aughts. They were just beginning to get a lot of and not only national but international attention. There were protests happening, marches. Jane Fonda came to our high school, and March we did a big there was a big binational march, and so I wanted to go deeper into what was happening and really explore the crimes. And I remember when I went up to my high school journalism teacher, she was like, she had a lot of reservations. She initially told me no, that is too dangerous. And then there was a big back and forth, like, but this is what you expect from us. And so after that back and forth, she realized, okay, well, if your grandmother's gonna take you, then I guess I'm okay with with it. And to this moment, because my grandmother, even after, I went away to college, and I was still kind of hesitating about, whether I was really going to pursue journalism. My grandmother kept asking, well, what are you going to do? Or when are you going to go to law school? When are you going to go to law school? And I would tell her, you were so instrumental in setting me on this other path to journalism, and and you didn't even realize it, right? Because she, like I talk about in the book, she drove me there. We were sitting there in this living room with these mothers talking about how they lost their daughters. One of the women took me outside and was pointing to house after house after house where someone had lost a mother, a daughter, a sister. And it was the first time that I had really had to reckon with this privilege, this huge privilege I had, having been born just on the other side of the border. Because if you looked at the photos of those girls, so many of them looked just like me. And so then I think that was really, it kind of opened a fountain in my writing. Like it just gave me a purpose, a drive to really want to tell stories, to tell these stories that don't get told, that to hold truth to power, right? To hold the powerful accountable. And so every time she would ask me, like, well, when are you going to law school? I'm like, Tita, you're the reason I'm here. You're the reason I'm here. And now I'm at the New York Times. But it wasn't really real for my family that, like, it was a big deal until I came out, that I had chosen the right path, until I appeared on Univision. Like that was the that
Okay,
was the moment where they're like, oh, okay, we get it. So,
that's great.
but yeah, I think it's given me the purpose, and I take the stories of those women with me everywhere, because what I heard from their mothers was, my daughter wanted to be someone, Claudia wanted to be someone, Silvia wanted to be someone, and I just I followed that for them.
Wow. Yes, you mentioned in the book that really stayed with me. As a professor of communication and a person who trains journalists as well, you say, you talk about yourself in an interesting way. You say, well, I was considered a vaga, but I did very well in school, right? But you said there, I was angry. In your book, you said, I was so angry. And I go there, and you sat in one of the girls' rooms, the bedroom, and you realize that's exactly how my bedroom looked like, right? And you say, confronted with my privilege that day, I remember I realized then I could no longer squander it. If Sylvia had been taken, her death will not be in vain. She will be somebody to me. and I will try to become someone better for her and for Claudia and for Alejandra, the name of the three girls that were killed in the feminicide problems that plagued the city of Juarez. I would like to follow up a question with that. You mentioned about embers, little things that keep there through years, and I wanted to ask you, when you look back, to those moments, you see this book as part of keeping that promise. You almost make a promise to these girls, right? That your voice, you don't say I'm going to be your voice, but you say you deserve to have a voice, and your lives were ended. So you see this book as part of that.
Yes, certainly, certainly. I definitely see a part of that. I see it as part of keeping El Paso's memory, right? I was really trying, I was following the lives of five families who had crossed through the city, dating all the way to the Mexican Revolution. And I was really trying to show how this city has been at the center of the nation's immigration battles, even before that border was drawn, right? Like that it had been there from the beginning. And so and how it had been this we could El Paso was a place where you could really study how nativism, xenophobia, this white supremacy had really helped shape immigration policy in the United States, and who was allowed in and who was allowed, who was considered desirable and undesirable. Like, you could really see it through here. It was integral to how we have shaped immigration policy in the city. But you could also see the resistencia to that, right? Like the alternative ways of thinking, the way that these rules could be melded and bent, and identities could kind of collapse and collide into each other in everyday life. And so that's what I was really trying to capture, really trying to bring that history up, and like provide an accurate a record of that.
Yes, I would like to go after this question to go into the families, which I found fascinating. You follow these families for 100 years, some of them even more. But you mentioned I don't remember which chapter of the book, but you mentioned at the very beginning that the August 3rd, 2019 massacre in El Paso, in Walmart in El Paso, really stop you in your tracks. You were working for the Boston Globe, and you were sent to El Paso to cover it. And you said this shooting was a turning point, what I can recall for you, right? Was that the moment when you realized that the story of El Paso needed to be told as a full story rather than and with history, right? With the background of the history rather than just breaking news. So what was that moment for you?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very, very difficult assignment. I think it's one of the hardest assignments I've ever had. Like I say in the book, I went to high school 3 minutes from there, and if there's anybody on the call from El Paso, I went to Burgess High School. People always ask. Um, and my it affected so many people that I know and love. Like my best friend's dad was at the store that day, and he escaped just before, just as the gunfire started. And so I kept returning to this scene. I kept returning to the scene that I described at the beginning of the book, right? This memorial that formed on this hill overlooking both cities. You could see how El Paso stretches into Ciudad Juarez, and how they blend, and how they can really seem like one if when you're looking at it from that perspective. And so as I kept, coming back to the scene, I kept thinking about how when I was younger, like I say in the book, I was angry. I was angry about my parents' divorce. I just felt like there was just so much out there. Like I was just constantly thinking, I was like just this other hometown kid, right? Trying to get out of my hometown. And then once I did, I discovered, wow, actually it came from a really special place. I went to the University of Texas at Austin, which can be very overwhelming when you're from a city like El Paso, where it's 80% Hispanic, to go to a city that's then predominantly white and such a huge campus. And so it was at UT that I realized, wow, like I'm actually from a really special place. It's a place that allowed me to be all parts of myself, as much Mexican as I am American. to, to speak English and Spanish and to mix them however I want. But now that I was a reporter, when I became a national political reporter, I was beginning to realize, well, it's even more than that, right? Because this city has been a portal into the land that would become the United States way before there ever was a United States. And we just at the time, people were already were once again calling El Paso the Ellis Island of the Southwest or the new Ellis Island. But at this Ellis Island, we were seeing, migrants getting penned up under bridges at the border, under these border bridges, families being separated at the border and held in camps, children being held in camps not too far from El Paso in this place called Tornillo, right? And so those were the images that were already coming out of my hometown before I even went back to the shooting. And now we had this other huge moment. And so I was thinking about all those things and really, again, trying to place that the city in this much larger context and in this episode, not as this rupture in our history, but part of this much larger sordid legacy of racist violence in this country.
Good. And now that you talk about El Paso as Ellis Island, is the central argument of your book. You say that El Paso should occupy a central, foundational place in the U.S. as a nation, in the national mythology of the U.S. In simple terms, what does that mean to you? How this mythology will look like if El Paso becomes Ellis Island? Thinking about what Ellis Island means to the United States, right? How does it look?
Yeah. Yeah, we would appreciate the work we would appreciate the labor of our workers, a lot of them Mexicanos and Latinos who come into this country and have helped build the American Southwest as we know it today. And now, not only now the American Southwest, but all, the Midwest and the South. And so I think it would be a different vision of the border, understanding our border not through this lens of national security and violence, but this rich, vibrant mix of people who have given so much up for this country and have sacrificed so much for this country. And we'd also be able to see that it's always been this multiracial, multi-ethnic stomping ground, right? Where, like I've said before, these rules of race, whether it's Jim Crow or Juan Crow, are
Mhm.
are established, but they're also broken and defied in different ways. And I think that carries lessons for all of us as Americans and as fronterizos, because as fronterizos growing up, we tend to think that the border is just Mexican and American, right? Or predominantly white and brown, and actually it's not like we have many of our cities have a rich Chinese, Asian culture because these transnational currents and of labor, of work, of ideas have always kind of have historically passed through these cities before.
Yeah. And I would like to start, if you can tell us more about these five families that you follow during 100 years in your book. First of all, what guided your choice of these particular families? What you hope to reveal about the border, following them, for example, Antonio and Erlinda Chu, who are Mexican Chinese immigrants who come from, I think Erlinda comes from Guadalajara, right? And Antonio comes from Guangzhou. Erlinda's family also come from Guangzhou, and then she goes back and forth, right? She goes back and forth to China and comes back and helps immigrants as during the Chinese Exclusion Act. So what does their story help us to understand about race, exclusion, and belonging in the borderlands?
Yeah, so I was really trying to find, again, families who were emblematic of that migration experience that I'm talking about, right? That ebb and flow, people who are coming in and then being cast out throughout these really nativist times. And again, I was trying to bring in the diversity of that the Latinidad, the Latino community, right? Because I was, in my mind, I was I was trying to write a very Mexican history of the American Southwest, but I was also trying to expand that Mexicanness, like how we think about that Mexicanness, how diverse that is, right? How diverse that can be. And so, and at the time that I was reporting this out, I was just seeing I was hearing a lot of racism from Mexican Americans who had been in the United States for so long and whose own grandparents had come across the border, right? That they were now like looking down upon these newer groups of people that were now coming across, whether they were Venezuelans or Haitians or indigenous Mayans from Guatemala. And I was hearing a lot of I was in this shelter actually in San Diego, in Tijuana, and because if we remember, there were record numbers of migrants who were crossing in 2021, 2022 during the Biden administration, and a lot of people were getting sent back and just kind of, for lack of a better word, just dumped on the other side of the border, and they were ending up in these huge shelters, with very little. And so I was in one of these shelters in Tijuana, and it was just, a lot of people from Venezuela and Guatemala and Honduras, and they were telling me like, oh, the guards were just very the border patrol agents, they were just so cruel. They took away my stuff, but they were also, saying these racist slurs to me, and and in my head I thought, well, I don't even remember how I asked it, but I was picturing a white Border Patrol agent, but then I remembered actually Border Patrol agents now, about 50% Hispanic, 60% Hispanic, and they were telling me, no, eran mexicanos o eran latinos, ellos también. Like they were telling me, like even as they were browner than I was, they would tell me, and they were complaining about how cruel they had been treated. And so I was thinking to myself, like, wow, we've really forgotten our own story and our own history. And so I was already kind of thinking about how I wanted to tackle those issues of race and those theories of, not only because I was realizing it's not only white supremacy, but this theory of mestizaje and these theories about Latinidad, and kind of trying to explore that more. But again, I wanted to really center it around people and how it played out in these families' everyday lives. And so some of the families I met through, I'd been reporting on immigration for, for more than a decade. So some of them kind of I had already identified through the reporting I had met through other stories. And I realized as I was doing the research, like, oh, this family story really captures this part of the experience. So it was like a mix of people who were very emblematic, families who were very emblematic of these themes and histories that I was looking at, but I was also that were also open to talking to me about it, and were open to sitting with me sometimes for, 5, 6 hours in
Wow.
their living room, going through some of the most, difficult times in their family's life, for the Martinezes who were repatriated during their grandparents were repatriated during the 1930s, which was like the first, mass deportation of Mexicans and Mexican Americans this country has seen. That was an episode that they did not talk about with anyone
Yeah.
because it was just so painful.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that, the Martinez family experience, that Mexican repatriation, return to Mexico, and they were, you mentioned, you talk about their story. They were even begging on the streets in Mexico. They were not doing that great. It was during the Great Depression. Mexico went also through the Great Depression, and it was just coming out of a revolution. The United States was also going through the Great Depression. And you show that, I mean, when you talk about Erlinda and Antonio, Erlinda says, I'm caught between two nationalisms, right? As a Chinese Mexican, and she's referring to Mexico and the United States. And the Martinezes, when they finally come back to the United States, they feel unwanted on both sides of the border. What did their history and your conversations with their descendants, with the is the grandson, right, of the Martinez family, teach you about the memory, silence, and shame in immigrant families? What does that teach us?
I learned that silence is vast it's so profound, and it it's damaging. It's damaging to our family, to our memory of who we are as a people here in the United States. It functions as a sort of historical erasure, and it seems to me like but it's not a bug. It's like a feature of a broken system, right? And that is the hardest part to reckon with and and really process. But again, but like I said, I also like I keep saying, like, I also found there's always someone, like, even with, like, there's always a form of resistance even within families, right? Like the Martinez's grandson, Raúl Reyes, who became a historian and was digging up records from his own family, right? The reason I was able to even put together as much as I was able about Miguel. The reason I was able to put together a picture, as rich a picture as I was, of Victoria and Miguel Martinez, was
Mhm.
because he had started to break that cycle, started to break that silence, and had been meticulously trying to get his own records from Mexico, from Chihuahua, from, these little towns in Santa Eulalia to, Sierra Blanca and in Texas. Like he had already kind of started that journey. And I feel like everybody, like a lot of families have that one person who's trying to who's trying to preserve that history. And I definitely identified that person within each of the families that I interviewed, like for the Jews, it was one of Erlinda's grandsons had also been meticulously collecting, records, ship manifests of her times going back and forth. So I was able to create like a really rich archive, and I had a good starting point as I was digging into these national archives myself.
Yes,
So
I remember you going with your mom to Santa Eulalia and finding that statue of your ancestor, right? And this debate about, could you tell us a little bit about that debate?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and so that was the other thing that I was discovering, because I initially, when I wrote the proposal for the book, I only put myself in the beginning. Like I didn't think I was going to put so much of my own family's history in there, but then I started feeling like a hypocrite as I was sitting with these families, because I was starting to realize, like, wow, I don't really know much about my own family. And here I am asking this very difficult question of Raúl about, how what happened to your grandmother when she repatriated, and they ended up losing everything when they went to Chihuahua, and not realizing, like, oh, or asking Raúl. I was asking Raúl about uh Victoria going through the baths, right? These gasoline baths at the border that all Mexican workers were subjected to, because they were thought to have lice, and they were asked to strip down and then sprayed with these chemicals. And I was asking him, like, hey, did you do you remember if Victoria ever talked about this moment, or your either of your grandparents? And then I realized, like, I haven't even asked my own grandparents that. And once I did, I found out that they had actually been braceros and had been subjected to it many times. And I never even knew that.
Mm.
So at this, so in looking in searching for Victoria, and searching for these traces of Victoria, Raul's grandmother, who was, whose hometown was Santa Eulalia,
Mhm.
I realized, well, like, my family's also from Chihuahua. My grandmother is from Chihuahua, and I had heard so many stories growing up about Chihuahua. And so my mother and I set out to kind of to find her own, her trying to find her own childhood home, which we didn't succeed in finding. It had been, torn down. And but we came across in Santa Eulalia, I was looking for records about Victoria, and I gave this city official this former mayor the name of my name. I introduced myself as Jazmine Ulloa, and then he says he says, "Oh, well, por la culpa de tu pariente, Santa Eulalia is not the capital of Chihuahua." And I was like, "What do you mean? By the fault of your ancestor, uh, by the fault of your ancestor, Santa Eulalia is not the capital." He's like, there was this man, right, Don Antonio Reza de Ulloa. I'm butchering the name, but he cast this vote. He cast the defining vote, that last vote to make Chihuahua the capital instead of Santa Eulalia, and that there's like a big statue of him in Chihuahua now. And I thought, yeah, that's not that can't be related to me. My dad's family is from Jalisco. Like my dad's from Puerto Vallarta. Like it's probably a different branch of Ulloas. I don't think that man is related to me. But much later, when I'm asking my dad about our history, he starts telling me about these protests that he was a part of in Ciudad Juarez, and one of them took place in Chihuahua, and he had a very similar experience where he had seen that statue, and they had told him like, "Hey, tu pariente está acá. Like, did you see that there's a statue of your pariente?" And I was like, "Wait a minute, wait a minute." And that story was like, "Wait, what are you talking about?" Like, I know what statue you're talking about. He's like, "Well, actually, Mija, he is related to us." Like it's very likely. Like I've done some research, and I was like, "What? You've done research?" So there were so many moments like that throughout where I was like, "Wait a minute, why didn't I think to ask this?" And then just discovering this whole new world that I didn't know had helped shape me.
That's amazing. I mean, I could see as I was reading your book, I said I poured through the stories that were so interesting. I mean, you talk about La Santa de Cabora, the most dangerous Mexican girl, and the rebellion that she was accused of inciting, but at the end she doesn't. I mean, it's not uh, corroborated by history. We don't know, but her ideas, right? And you talk about different, I mean, from Pancho Villa to Madero, of course, to Los Flores Magón in the city, and even Lauro Aguirre, right? The early journalist that publishes the Independent, right, along with the Flores Magón. I would like to follow into the families as well. The Rubio sisters, they are a very interesting case. They are also, I mean, the Martinezes are deported during the 30s, the Mexican repatriation, and the Rubios. When I was reading about the Rubios, I was like, wait a minute, is this the 30s? No, it's the 70s, right? They get caught they go into a festival in this town. I forgot the name of the town, pardon me. It's probably fresh in your memory, but they go into this festival that immigrants are not supposed to be, and they get caught by the border patrol and they get sent back. And then the sisters come back, and they cross through El Paso again, and they become these politicians, right? They are in office right now in California. So how do you see that the connection of the stories, right? And then you talk about two more families, the Holguins, more recently, that go through the asylum process, and the murals from Guatemala, right? What do you see connecting? What do you see similar, different? I mean, it seems that history repeats itself, and then it has a different iteration there, right? So if you want to talk about the Rubios and the
Yeah. The sisters they went to the Texas Rice Festival in Winnie, Texas in the 70s. In the 70 through 75, 77 was their whole kind of trying to make it in Texas, and then being deported from Winnie. But yeah, I think I was trying to show, I was really trying to show that the cyclical nature of our immigration debate, and how, like I said, this country is so reliant on labor and on immigrants' labor, and yet it goes through these kind of really xenophobic nativist periods where it casts people out. And so I was trying to show how with each iteration of this that xenophobia and nativism has been growing louder and louder, and because of that the policies have become harsher and harsher, and the journey to get north to reach the north has become deadlier and deadlier with each of these turns of history. Um, and so I was trying to show how each family had kind of gone through that journey and yet had overcome had overcome a lot of had overcome um a lot of this in many ways, for lack of a better word, like had the resilience of families, um and how it has had different outcomes for people, right? And how that can be so haphazard, and it just, like, even how we're seeing it today, like we're in the middle of another type of period today, right? We're in the middle of the harshest immigration crackdown we've seen since World War II. And we're seeing a lot of that legal landscape, people who had different forms of immigration status, legal forms of immigration status, now become illegal through different ways, whether their programs have been cut, their path to citizenship is getting harder. So we're seeing this iteration play out yet again in a much
Hmm.
harsher light. And so yeah, so that's kind of what I was experimenting with, and a lot of the I was trying to show too, like some of the families are like opposite sides of the same coin, like the Chus and the Martinezes, right? They were going through this period of intense xenophobia against Mexican workers in the United States, Mexican and Chinese workers in the United States, but also Chinese workers in northern Mexico, and how that xenophobia and nativism, just like the liberal ideas, don't know border, like just like the liberal ideas that were crossing across the border, that just as the liberal ideas didn't, were flowing across the border, so was these waves of xenophobia and nativism, and how that also plays out.
That is very interesting. Were you expecting to find such entrenched xenophobic sentiment in Mexico as well? Or was that a surprise for you when you were talking about especially the Jews and the repatriated family members?
Yeah, no, it was surprising to me. Like, I was learning so many things. Like, I didn't know El Paso, that so many Chinese laborers had called El Paso the beacon of hope. I didn't know that it had been such an important crossing for Asian immigrants into the United States, because usually you think about Angel Island in San Francisco, but in that period you see how, because of the rising xenophobia in the United States, it started in California and spreads across the country, but also in northern Mexico, El Paso becomes kind of like this sanctuary, this hub during this period, where the violence wasn't as pronounced as in other parts of Texas or the country, the violence against Asian Americans and Chinese Americans. And then, wait, so I lost the thread of the question. I guess Oh,
Yes,
if it was surprising to me,
you
yeah,
were
it was,
surprised.
yeah, it was definitely. Oh, and I wanted to just, shout out Evelyn, Dr. Evelyn Hudehart, who's done a lot of that research, and she was just so instrumental. I had Zoom calls with her, about how to find materials, and I read a lot of her studies. I mean, she was the one who's really laid the groundwork to uncover that history. She's been one of the main academics and voices to do it. And yeah, so I I turned to a lot of scholars who had been trying to uncover that history on both sides of the border. Not only El Paso historians, and there were so many, Yolanda Leiva, David Dorado Romo on in El Paso, but then also like some of the Juarense historians as well, people who were leading like Evelyn and well, Evelyn is in Mexico City, but people who have been opening like museums in Juarez, commemorating the Mexican Revolution, and these sites where these Magonistas played, like there, it's been a very joint effort.
You definitely document the Villista sentiment, the anti-Asian sentiment, and the reason why the Jews moved to El Paso, right? I mean, they were well-to-do reasonably in Juarez. They were doing well. They had La Garantía, their store and everything, and they had to move to El Paso during the whole revolt and the anti-Chinese sentiment in Mexico. So you document these very complex stories and history of El Paso, and I will ask you, who do you imagine is your main audience when you were writing your book, and what is what you wanted them to understand about the border? Who is your intended audience, we might say? For you,
I
imagining?
Yeah, I often pictured my little sister. My
Good.
sister's 4.5 years younger than me. So I often pictured her while I was writing, but I was also picturing all kinds of Americans. Like there were times, I went back and forth about whether I wanted to translate the Spanish, and I decided I did because it could be anybody who's reading it. The United States I'm writing for is really diverse, so I was picturing just different friends. And like I said, I did feel like I was writing for two, and I've said this in other interviews, like two different audiences, right? This broader national audience that tends to understand the border only through the violence and through these migration crises. And then I felt like I was writing for fronterizos like myself, who really understood that binational fluidity of the region, but still like myself didn't know that El Paso had once been called the beacon of hope. Didn't know that there were this crop of independent Mexican journalists and activists and intellectuals who were crossing into the United States and forming their own newspapers and trying to take down this authoritarian regime on the other side. And so that I feel like
Your
that's what I'm
audience.
writing for. I was like, I had these two audiences in mind, but mainly, I was like, would my sister think this is cool? Like, would she laugh at this?
That's good. That's very nice. Going back to the idea of El Paso as Ellis Island, which is your main hypothesis, what would you say to people who said we did not cross the border crossed us? About well, now this is Ellis Island.
I'm sorry, what was the question? It kind of,
Yeah, what would you say to people who say that we didn't cross the border crossed us? About this turning El Paso into Ellis Island.
yeah. So what would I say to people who believe like that the border
Cross them.
cross them like fronterizos, what would I say? Yeah, I mean, I'd say they were, I mean, right, they were. I'm trying to make this argument that there is well, it goes back to the origins of this book, right? This and where this all started for me, right? Was this self-proclaimed white supremacist drove from Dallas into
Mhm.
El Paso
Yes.
to to kill Mexicans, is what he told an officer on the on the street that day, one of the officers who arrested him, and he had posted this online screed on the internet 17 minutes before he started shooting, that decried the Hispanic invasion of Texas. And what I'm trying to show is like if you understand El Paso's history, if we really were to center the city's history, move this place from the margins of our history to the center, you would see that there's no such thing as a Hispanic invasion of Texas. There's not a there's Mexico has always been a part, Mexican culture, Mexican people have always been a part of the United States because this country was Mexico before it was the United States, and it was Spanish before that, and it was indigenous before that. And then all of these periods have informed the culture of the American Southwest as we know it.
That's very good. I have another question. As I was following the Holguin family, which is a sad, very sad case, um, along with the violence that starts with the war on drugs and how Juarez becomes a very violent city, right? Worldwide focus in Juarez with the war on drugs, the cartels, and you explain very, very well the links between the cartels and the authorities, local and elsewhere authorities. And it crossed my mind this, I think last year, there is one Mexican journalist, Jesus Esquivel, who wrote a book about the cartels in the United States. And he says, how he argued that to understand the fentanyl and the drug trafficking, we need to look at the organized crime inside the United States. How do you see U.S. criminal networks fitting into the story you tell about El Paso and the borderlands, especially when you talk about this violent period, right? You talk about the violence of the revolution. How do you see that fitting into the narrative of El Paso?
Well, if the Mexican Revolution was the first time we saw this mass migration of this large migration of Mexicans into the United States, and it was like this seminal moment in Mexican and American history where it kind of created the path that Mexicanos and Latinos would be following for generations. Um, but the drug war in Mexico and the violence that produced created even greater number of migrations. And I was trying to show how the US had played a role in these interventions starting in the 50s, right? It started with the Cold War, and then it became kind of the drug war in all these different Latin American countries, and that the destabilization that was happening in large part because of the US role, and in large part with the help of the United States, that was decentralized, that was destabilizing this region, was causing these greater migrations of Latinos, of Latin Americans north, and following the same paths that were created during the Mexican Revolution. So to me, it was like kind of like the next, like I keep saying, it was kind of like the next iteration, and it's making it's just making it it's part of the reason what's made the journey north deadlier and harder for people to take on. But it's also part of what's made it in the United States difficult for people to acquire status, because we haven't updated our immigration laws to address these huge these more modern phenomenon, whether it's whether it's how these cartels have been able to uh, diversify. They have human smuggling and cartel, and they're smuggling people and guns and at much greater quantities, and they've moved into the United States and have cells in the United States. But so like the profit incentive is higher, and yet we haven't found a way to really address that. We can, other than like we're going to address the root causes of migration in Central America, but then.
Hmm. So would you agree? I think you mentioned it several times that, especially when you said this is a cycle, right? I'm seeing these cyclical moments, and you mentioned the latest years of Biden, when the sentiment, you mentioned a Pew Research poll about that there was a high sentiment about migrants, right? Sometime around the Biden administration at the beginning, that people were sort of at the end of the first Trump administration, people were for a brief moment, the American sentiment was in favor of receiving more immigrants, and then it shifted, right? So would you agree, after writing and doing this very well-researched book, historical, that there is the intention of production of criminality from the US especially the production of criminality in the borderlands, right? It's intentional. Would you agree with that? Or would you say, well, maybe we can change it?
I'm not sure I understand the question that you I'm not sure I
Would
understand
you
the
agree that the criminalization of Mexicans and the criminalization of the border as a place is intentional? It's an intentional national narrative, sort of a dominant intentional. Just you mentioned people coming from Kansas and from other places to shoot migrants in the border, right? Because they were fearful about being replaced and about the invasion and about those things. And we keep hearing this rhetoric. So would you agree that it's a production of criminality?
well, and the scholars that I spoke with would say it is. I mean, and that would say because of this drug war. I remember speaking with one professor. Oh my gosh, her name is escaping me right now, but she told it to me very clear. It's like Latinos have been colored, Latinos across the United States, Mexican Americans across the United States have been colored by this criminality. Like our identities we were defined, fronterizos like you and me are defined by this version of criminality, even though it's consumers much further north in the United States that are buying these drugs, and then it just kind of that's another way of absolving the United States in the role and the shared role that they've had in destabilizing these countries. And in the book, but in the book, like I try to explain that it's not just a US narrative, but it's a Mexican narrative as well, because it stems all the way to these Mexican intellectuals and activists and workers that were crossing into El Paso and across the borderland. They were organizing unions. They were talking about fair wages and fair work hours, and they were, condemning the discrimination of Mexican workers in the United States. And alongside of that, they were also planning armed revolt, right? There were different, just much like today, there was like different factions, a spectrum of these liberal activities. But a lot of the men who were getting labeled as dangerous and criminal were people were men and women who had these dangerous ideas of equality and fairness. So that's part of that historical erasure that I'm talking about. Like that there was, yes, there were many of Mexican gun runners during the Mexican Revolution, and there was this trade, right? Like I discussed in the book, there was this trade of guns and drugs even back then. But there were also these other ideas, these other ideas that were crossing, that were getting labeled as dangerous as well, and it conflates the two, right? The states conflate the two, whether
Yeah,
it's the American state or the Mexican state.
I have we are almost over with time, but I have a last question. How do you see the metaphor imagining El Paso as an Ellis Island? How do you see that stopping that absolving the US from its responsibility with Latin American interventions and prosecuting people who are, liberals and have these ideas about equality and migrants who want to work? How do you see that idea helping bring that uh, better the narrative about the border?
I think it just kind of helps elevate the city and bringing it to the fore of the national consciousness in the way that we hold Ellis Island and helping kind of um it's still it's an imperfect one, right? Because like I said, people cross oceans to get to Ellis Island, and the migration was European, was predominantly European, and in the through El Paso through the Southwest, like I said, it's more of this ebb and flow. Um, but I still think that it's a very powerful symbol in American history and culture. And it helps give El Paso its due place in in the telling of the American story.
That's very good. I have one last question for you. We have students in the audience, and you're very accomplished, very young, um,
Oh, yeah.
passionate reporter and correspondent, journalist. Looking back from your first high school articles when you were 16, crossing the border, and your work at Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, what has kept you committed to covering the Latinx and border stories, even when the work might be very hard, emotionally draining? And what would you recommend to students who want to follow your life trajectory or your professional trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's kept me committed is goes back to that very moment on the border in the homes of those women. Like I said, um, Claudia, Alejandra, Silvia, like I said, I carry with them with me everywhere. I really think back to how, like I said, how much privilege I have. And I think what also keeps me driven because it is a very difficult career path, especially now. Like it always has been. I graduated during a very tumultuous time. We were like, it was at the end of the 2008 recession. I was like, every newspaper I knew was on a hiring freeze. It was very much like the pandemic, like people who graduated during the pandemic. But like in every job that I've had, it's gone through restructuring or layoffs, or it's just a very, very hard industry. And then to be wanting to be a Latina and to be wanting to tell Latino stories, that in itself is like we could have a whole other seminar about that alone, and the challenges that come with that. But like having just knowing that what you have to say is important, and that you like that curiosity and that desire to preserve the record, to create memory, it just has to be so much greater than anything else to keep propelling you forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Jasmine. Well, this definitely, you're fulfilling that dream, fulfilling that career, and telling us these stories, beautifully written. We will open the floor for questions from the audience. Let me see if I can get them. Um, Richard Phillips, he has a question. How deeply and formally codified were Juan Crow restrictions at the state level, municipal level, etc.?
I think they were more like social mores. It wasn't like Jim. It wasn't as codified as Jim Crow. It was more there were social mores that people had to abide by. So a lot of restaurants, this different establishments would have signs on the door saying, no dogs, no Mexicans, no dogs, no women, no Mexicans.
Mm.
It was like public public facilities, whether it was drinking fountains. Sometimes Mexicans would have their own facilities, especially in these more rural parts of Texas. But yeah, that was something I looked into. So there were some laws, but a lot of it was kind of like these unspoken rules of society.
Hmm. There is another question, but Denia Matamoros. It says, thank you very much, Jasmine, for your book presentation. I have not read the book yet, but your discussion made me think about El Paso as more than a geographic border. It seems to be a place where memory, migration, race, and family histories come together. What I knew about El Paso was about the historical relationship between Mexico and the US, particularly linked to Ciudad Juarez. As someone from Honduras, I was wondering, to what extent do the experiences of migrants from Central America reshape the way we understand El Paso's history, memory, and identity as a border city?
Yeah, I mean, and I this kind of comes through through in in the later chapters of the book, as I'm following, as it follows, Cash Mural, who's from Guatemala, but it talks about how the migration through the pass begins to change, right? In the as early as the Obama years, where before it used to be predominantly single Mexican men who crossed into the border and tended to work as braceros or in factories or you name it, right? And were sending money home and then eventually would bring their families. You started to see more women and children arriving at the border, and so that creates a different dynamic from which to understand the migration. But they're going into that, these families are and workers are facing a lot of the same struggles that Mexicans faced, a lot of the same rhetoric, and a broken system that was created to punish and deport Mexicans.
Hmm.
So it's and that's why it's such a broken system, because that's why it's even harsher, because these are women and children, like that creates even newer problems for the next administrations that come along.
Hmm. Um, there are no other questions, but I actually have a last question coming from your response to the Central America question, right? The Central American immigrant questions, and when you talk about Cash Miral and his brother, right? Um,
Oh, they're just friends, but yeah.
Oh, in the latest years, Mexico has, I mean, when I ask you about your intended audience, you responded is your sister and the national, sort of the mainstream United States audience, right? You mentioned in the book with great frustration that the history of El Paso needs to be told every 10 years, right? Because people tend to forget its importance. And as you were mentioning, migration from Central America, and especially the um, tacit collaboration of the Mexican government, tacit and not that tacit, sometimes explicit, to deter immigration from Central America in a way that Mexico has become a border, the whole country. So, what would you say to a Mexican audience about El Paso, about the importance of this region?
I would say that Juarez should hold just as important as a role to Mexico as El Paso should to the United States. That was actually one of the things that I discovered pretty early on, right? Because I set off, and I was so frustrated with how El Paso was portrayed, how it would come into, how it become this backdrop to these political battles, but the city, the richness of the city, of the culture wasn't truly captured in these daily articles or as these backdrops for candidates coming down to show they're tough on the border, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, right? They come down with their safety vests, with their vests, and have the photo shoot. So I was like, I had this kind of chip on my shoulder about El Paso, but then I start crossing into Ciudad Juarez and talking to historians on that side of the border, and they started to tell me, well, this Ciudad Juarez at one point was the capital for the entire Mexican government was run out of
Mhm.
Ciudad Juarez at one point, when Benito Juarez came to town and was, governing out of a rolling carriage, fleeing the French. And I thought that was remarkable. And they took me to the site where his office used to be, and all the places where, he stayed and had his morning coffee, and it's like that this is the most beloved president of Mexico, and of Mexico, and he's living there in Ciudad Juarez, and El Pasoans and Juarez's know about it, but do Mexicans in Mexico City, do they revere it as much as they should? Um, I would argue that the same could be, you could flip it. The same argument I was making for El Paso, you can make for Juarez to
Interesting.
Mexico.
And what about as a region for the two countries?
Yeah, I mean they operate together. You can't tell the story of one without the other. They were once one city deep in the heart of Mexican territory before they were split in two. So I think like I said, they should be equally important for both nations.
Well, is 105. I don't know if there any comments from Dr. Rivera Salgado.
Thank you, Jazmine and Antonita, for such a wonderful conversation. And before we let you go, Jazmine, what can we expect from you? What news are you following now? And what can we expect to read from you?
Well, I'm actually in Washington, D.C. right now for a conference on immigration and transparency. But we have some stories coming soon, kind of looking at the immigration courts, changes to the immigration courts, and just some really interesting cases under this crackdown that I can't say much about yet, but it should be out soon.